In the golden glow of the twin suns of Erythra V, the sprawling grassland shimmered with an iridescent hue, shifting between deep violet and aquamarine with the wind. The vast plains were dotted with skittering herds of Kavan, six-legged creatures whose hooves hummed faintly against the electrostatic ground. It was a world alive, breathing in colors and rhythms unfamiliar to earth-born sensibilities. For Taran Allcrest, it was home, or at least the closest thing to one since humanity had been scattered across the stars. Taran adjusted the reins of her mount, a Zelathan steed named Kale. With its towering frame, crystalline mane, and eyes that shimmered like liquid mercury, Kale was a sight to behold. Zelathans were renowned for their loyalty and intelligence, and Kale was no exception. Yet today, his steps faltered, and his tail lashed with an uncharacteristic nervousness. Taran's lips tightened. "Easy there, big guy," she murmured, patting his scaled neck. The texture was cool and smooth, like polished stone warmed by the sun. Kale's ears flicked back, a low, throaty whine escaping his broad chest. Taran glanced around the plain, searching for the source of his unease. The landscape was silent save for the rustling of grass and the occasional chirp of a hover drone zipping across the sky. Still, the air felt heavy, charged with something unseen. It reminded her of the moments before a sandstorm, when the world seemed to hold its breath. "What's got you spooked?" she whispered. But Kale's gaze was fixed ahead, ears pricked and nostrils flared. He stamped a hoof, sending a faint ripple across the electrostatic grass. Something was out there. The horizon was broken only by the silhouette of the outpost. A cluster of angular structures sat nestled against the base of the cliffs, their metal frames glinting in the sun's light. Beyond it, the mountains loomed, their jagged peaks cutting into the sky like blackened teeth. It was a harsh, unforgiving world, but it was theirs. Taran, a voice crackled through her comm unit. It was Grayson, her partner in this desolate venture. "You're taking your sweet time out there. We've got company, and I don't mean the friendly kind." Her grip on the reins tightened. Define company. An Orion-class cruiser dropped into orbit 30 minutes ago. Guess who it belongs to? Taran's stomach sank. The Syndicate. Bingo. We've got maybe an hour before their dropships hit dirt. Get back here, now. She nudged Kale forward, but the steed hesitated, his powerful legs trembling. The nervous energy rolling off him was palpable, and Taran couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see a Syndicate patrol, but there was nothing but the endless expanse of grass. They moved slowly, Kale's usual grace replaced by jittery, uneven steps. Taran's mind raced. The Syndicate, a conglomerate of pirates, mercenaries, and corporate thugs, didn't come out this far unless they wanted something. Something valuable. And if they wanted it, they'd take it by force. "Grayson, what's their trajectory?" she asked, her voice clipped. "Straight for us. They're not bothering to hide it, either." "Damn it." Taran's eyes narrowed. They had little in the way of defenses, a few automated turrets, and a perimeter shield that wouldn't hold against sustained fire. They weren't prepared for an assault. As the outpost grew closer, Kale's agitation only worsened. He reared suddenly, a sharp, high-pitched whinny escaping him. Taran fought to keep her balance, her heart pounding. "What is wrong with you?" she demanded, pulling hard on the reins. But Kale's eyes were wide, frantic, fixed on a single point in the distance. She followed his gaze and froze. a figure stood alone in the grass, stark against the vivid landscape. It was a girl, human by the look of her, though her features were obscured by the rippling heat haze. She didn't move, didn't call out. She just stood there, watching. Taryn's pulse quickened. There were no other human settlements on Erythra V, and she'd never seen this girl before. Something about her presence felt wrong. Alien, almost. Kale's whinnies turned to growls, an unsettling sound that resonated deep in his chest. He stamped the ground again and again, his entire body trembling. Then, as if possessed, he bolted toward the figure, nearly throwing Taryn from the saddle. "Kale, stop," she shouted, yanking on the reins with all her strength. But the steed didn't slow. His powerful strides devoured the distance, his breaths coming in ragged bursts. Taryn's heart raced as they hurtled toward the girl, who still hadn't moved. The world blurred. The suns blazed above, the grass whipped past, and the girl grew closer, her form sharpening with every stride. She had pale skin, hair that shimmered like starlight, and eyes that gleamed with an intensity that made Taryn's breath catch. Kale skidded to a stop mere feet from her, his chest heaving and his ears pinned flat. Taryn's grip on the reins was white-knuckled as she stared at the girl, who met her gaze with an unsettling calm. "Who are you?" Taryn demanded, her voice cracking. The girl tilted her head, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. "You don't remember me, do you?" she said softly. Taryn's blood ran cold. The voice was familiar, achingly so, yet impossible. Her throat tightened as the realization began to dawn, and the weight of the moment pressed down on her like a collapsing star. "No," she whispered. "It can't be." The girl's smile widened, and her eyes shimmered with something ancient and unfathomable. "But it is." Behind them, the horizon darkened as syndicate dropships descended like carrion birds. But in that moment, Taryn could only stare at the girl, her mind reeling and her heart pounding with a mix of fear and awe. The syndicate dropships tore through the sky, their hulking forms blotting out the suns. They cast long shadows over the plains, their engines roaring like distant thunder. Taryn's heart pounded as she spurred Kale into motion, away from the girl who now stood motionless in the grass, her eerie calm an echo in Taryn's mind. The girl's cryptic words gnawed at her, but survival took precedence. "Grayson, I'm on my way back. Syndicate dropships are incoming. Prepare the defenses." Taryn barked into her comm unit. Kale's hooves struck the ground with a ferocity that mirrored her own desperation, each impact sending waves rippling through the grass. "About time," Grayson replied, his voice tight. "We've armed the turrets, but against syndicate tech, we're sitting ducks." Taryn gritted her teeth. "Do what you can. Stall them. We just need enough time to figure out what they're after." The outpost loomed ahead, its metal walls shimmering with the faint hum of the perimeter shield. Grayson was already at the gate, his rifle slung over one shoulder and a grim determination etched into his face. As Taryn approached, Kale slid to a stop, his flanks heaving and eyes darting wildly. Grayson frowned, stepping forward. "What's with him?" "I don't know," Taryn admitted, dismounting. She glanced back toward the plains, but the girl was nowhere to be seen. Something spooked him out there. Grayson's gaze followed hers. "We've got bigger problems." The syndicate's making their move. Taryn barely had time to respond before the first blast rocked the outpost. The shield shimmered, absorbing the impact of the incoming fire, but it wouldn't hold for long. Taryn and Grayson sprinted for cover as the Syndicate dropships landed just beyond the perimeter, disgorging squads of heavily armed soldiers. Their black and red armor gleamed menacingly, and their movements were precise, efficient, predatory. "We can't take them head-on," Grayson said, ducking behind a supply crate. He activated a small holographic display, showing the positions of their automated turrets. "We'll have to use the terrain and pick them off." Taryn nodded, her mind racing. The Syndicate's presence here wasn't random. They wanted something, and they wouldn't leave until they got it. But what could they possibly need from a remote outpost like this? She didn't have time to ponder. Syndicate soldiers were advancing, their plasma rifles cutting through the air with precision. One of the turrets erupted in a shower of sparks, its defenses overwhelmed. Taryn gripped her own rifle tightly, her breaths shallow. "We've faced worse," she muttered, though she wasn't sure if it was true. Grayson snorted. "You're a terrible liar." Their banter was cut short as another explosion rattled the outpost, followed by the unmistakable whine of a hover tank. Taryn's stomach twisted. The Syndicate wasn't pulling any punches. "Grayson, fall back to the main building," she ordered. "We'll make our stand there." Grayson hesitated but nodded, covering Taryn as she retreated. Kale, still jittery, followed close behind, his powerful frame a reassuring presence. They reached the main building, a reinforced structure built to withstand Erythra V's harsh conditions, but not a full-scale assault. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The few other settlers huddled in corners, clutching makeshift weapons and looking to Taryn for leadership. She felt the weight of their gazes, their fear, their hope. "We hold them here," she said, her voice firm. "Stick to the plan. Use the choke points. Don't let them divide us." A young man stepped forward, his hands shaking. "What if they breach the building?" Taryn met his gaze, her expression hard. "Then we fight. Every second we hold them off is a second closer to reinforcements." The words rang hollow, but they spurred the settlers into action. They fortified the doors and windows, set traps, and took positions. Taryn's mind churned, calculating odds that grew slimmer by the second. Outside, the Syndicate's assault intensified. Plasma blasts scorched the walls, and the shield's hum faltered. The hover tank fired again, and this time, the impact sent a shockwave through the building. Dust rained from the ceiling, and a low groan reverberated through the structure. "Shields are down," Grayson called from his post near the entrance. "They're coming in." The settlers braced themselves as the Syndicate soldiers breached the outer defenses. The first wave was met with a barrage of fire from Taryn's group. She picked her targets carefully, each shot aimed to disable rather than kill. These soldiers weren't just enemies. They were a message, a display of power. Still, the Syndicate pressed on. Their precision was unnerving, their movements synchronized like parts of a well-oiled machine. Taryn's rifle ran dry, and she switched to her sidearm, her hands steady despite the chaos. The settlers fought valiantly, but the tide was turning. For every Syndicate soldier they took down, 2 more seemed to take their place. Amid the chaos, Taryn's thoughts drifted back to the girl. Who was she? How had she known Taryn? And why had Kale reacted so violently to her presence? The questions gnawed at her, a distraction she couldn't afford. Taryn. Grayson's shout snapped her back to the present. She turned to see him struggling against a Syndicate soldier, their weapons locked in a brutal grapple. Without hesitation, Terran fired, the shot finding its mark and dropping the soldier. Grayson nodded his thanks, his face pale but determined. "We can't hold them much longer." Before Terran could respond, a deep, resonant sound filled the air. It wasn't a weapon, nor was it the hover tank. It was a low, mournful hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. The Syndicate soldiers froze, their movements halting as they turned their heads toward the sound. Terran's eyes widened as she realized the source. Kale stood at the center of the room, his crystalline mane glowing faintly. The hum grew louder, resonating through the walls, the floor, her very bones. The Syndicate soldiers began to retreat, their faces etched with confusion and fear. "What the hell is happening?" Grayson asked, his voice barely audible over the sound. Terran didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on Kale, whose eyes now gleamed with an otherworldly light. The STEED's entire body seemed to vibrate, as if channeling some ancient, untapped power. For the first time since the assault began, hope flickered in Terran's chest. The air inside the outpost hummed with an electric energy that seemed to emanate from the very walls, as if the structure itself was alive and responding to the presence of something extraordinary. It carried a static charge that prickled against the skin, accompanied by a faint metallic tang that lingered in the air. Kale stood at the center of it all, his crystalline mane cascading like a waterfall of molten glass, each strand shimmering with hues of electric blue and silver. The light pulsed in rhythmic waves, as if echoing an unseen heartbeat, casting intricate patterns on the walls and floor around him. Syndicate soldiers hesitated, their formation breaking as they retreated, confusion etched on their faces. Terran stepped forward cautiously, her weapon lowered. "Kale," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was addressing her mount or something far older. Something awakened within him. The hum grew louder, rising in pitch until it became a high, piercing tone that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of those within the outpost. The walls quivered faintly, as if responding to the frequency, while the ground beneath their feet felt unstable, as though trembling in anticipation. Terran winced as the sound burrowed into her skull, a searing ache spreading through her temples, while others stumbled, their movements disoriented by the overwhelming resonance. Even the air seemed heavier, carrying a palpable tension that made every breath feel like a struggle. Terran clutched her head as the sound resonated through her skull, but the Syndicate soldiers fared worse. They stumbled back, dropping their weapons as they clutched their ears. The hover tank's system sputtered, its engines choking before it collapsed to the ground in a lifeless heap. Grayson staggered to Terran's side, his expression a mix of awe and terror. "What is he doing?" "I don't know," Terran admitted, her eyes locked on Kale. "But it's working." The Syndicate soldiers, now disoriented and uncoordinated, began a full retreat. Some glanced over their shoulders, their expressions a mixture of fear and bewilderment, as if haunted by the impossible power they had just witnessed. One soldier stumbled, his weapon slipping from his trembling hands, while another barked orders in a voice that cracked under the weight of panic. They moved like a broken tide, scattering in all directions before regrouping in a hasty, chaotic march to their dropships. The realization that they were no match for the strange energy radiating from Kale had seeped into their very bones, leaving only one imperative: escape. They scrambled back to their dropships, which sputtered and groaned under the weight of Kale's strange, otherworldly energy. One by one, the ships lifted off, their movements erratic as they fled into the sky. The sound abruptly stopped. Silence fell over the outpost, broken only by the distant roar of the Syndicate's engines as they vanished into the atmosphere. Taryn let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she holstered her weapon. "Is it over?" someone whispered. Taryn turned to the settlers, who were emerging cautiously from their hiding places. "For now," she said, but her gaze lingered on Cale, whose light had dimmed, his body swaying as if the effort had drained him. She rushed to his side, placing a steadying hand on his neck. "Cale, talk to me. Are you okay?" His eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something, an intelligence, a presence, staring back at her. Then he collapsed to the ground, his massive body trembling. "We need to get him inside," Taryn said, her voice firm despite the panic clawing at her chest. Grayson and a few others helped maneuver Cale into the main building, where they laid him on the smooth, reinforced floor. His breaths were shallow, his luminous mane now dull. Taryn knelt beside him, her hands brushing against the strange, scaled texture of his flank. She whispered soothing words, though she wasn't sure if they were for him or herself. Grayson crouched nearby, his brow furrowed. "That wasn't just a horse," he said. "Was it?" "No," Taryn admitted, "and I don't think it ever was." The settlers gathered around, their faces a mix of curiosity and fear. One of them, an older woman named Rhea, stepped forward. "I've seen something like this before," she said, her voice trembling. "Back on the Los Prime. The Zelathan steeds, they're not just animals. They're conduits." "Conduits?" Taryn asked. Rhea nodded. "For energy. For life. For something we don't fully understand. On Los, they said the Zelathans were bonded to their riders in ways that went deeper than biology. Some believed they held fragments of the world's consciousness, its essence." Taryn looked down at Cale, her mind reeling. Was that what had happened out there? Had Cale tapped into something ancient, something tied to the very fabric of his planet? Before she could ask more, a faint glow began to emanate from Cale's chest. The settlers gasped, stepping back as the light grew brighter, casting long shadows on the walls. Taryn didn't move, her hand still resting on Cale's neck. The light coalesced into a single point, glowing brighter with each passing second until it was almost too intense to bear. Then, in a silent burst, it expanded outward, shaping itself into the silhouette of a young girl. Her translucent form shimmered like a constellation brought to life, with threads of light flowing through her figure like veins of liquid starlight. She moved with an ethereal grace, each step leaving faint ripples of luminescence on the ground, as though she was walking on the fabric of reality itself. Her hair seemed to float in an unseen breeze, its strands glowing with a soft, otherworldly radiance. Her eyes, twin orbs of luminous silver, locked onto Taryn with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through her soul. It was the girl from the plains, her shimmering form ethereal and otherworldly. Taryn's breath caught as the girl's luminous eyes met hers. "You're the key," the girl said, her voice resonating like a melody. "The bond between you and your steed is more than you know. Together, you are a force that can protect this world and others like it." "Protect it from what?" Taryn asked, her voice barely a whisper. The girl's expression turned somber. "The Syndicate is only the beginning. There are greater threats, far older and more dangerous. But you have the power to stand against them. Trust in your bond. Trust in him. The light began to fade, and the girl's form dissolved into shimmering motes that drifted into Cale's body. His breathing steadied, his mane regaining its faint glow. Taryn felt a surge of warmth, a connection so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "What now?" Grayson asked, his voice breaking the silence. Taryn stood, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The syndicate might have been driven off, but she knew they'd return, and next time, they'd come with more than soldiers. Whispers of experimental war machines and tales of a shadowy enforcer who left entire colonies in ruins had already reached her ears. And next time, they wouldn't come alone. "Now," she said, her voice steady, "we prepare for whatever's coming." Cale stirred beside her, his eyes meeting hers with a renewed clarity. The bond between them felt stronger than ever, a quiet promise of the battles to come. Together, they would face the storm, no matter how dark the skies grew.